All right, welcome back. My name is Alonso Garcia, and I am your host for Teleos Freedom and Unfiltered Faith. This is the third in a series that we are doing focused on leadership. We've looked at some people in the Old Testament up to this point that were called to lead despite how they felt. We looked at Moses. He had some insecurity, uncertain as to whether or not he was capable of fulfilling God's call. We also looked at Gideon, and Gideon is a really interesting character. He's threshing grain in a wine press. I've never threshed grain and I've never pressed wine, but I can only imagine that the wood and the wine and probably impacted the flavor of the bread some. We looked at his insecurities as well, and how he challenged God, and he says, God, sure, I'm going to believe you, but show me a sign. One of the things that I highlighted is that sometimes when we tell God, hey, we're looking for a sign, you could make the argument very easily that the enemy, the devil, Satan, would hear something like that and said, oh, I'll give you exactly what you're looking for, and you might end up down the wrong path. Proverbs 14:12 was one of the verses that we looked at. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And so the next thing that we want to look at is going to be David. So David is called to lead despite humble beginnings and horrific behavior. So one of the things that I wanted to ensure that I did and maintained a line of faithfulness to is some of these folks we look at as heroes of the faith, and rightfully so, don't get me wrong. But they also acted in ways that are completely unbiblical, like Moses murdering an Egyptian. We would, in many people's minds, if you were to commit that kind of act of murder, whether, they would want some form of justice. And there are others that would say, well, he was murdering one of the captors, and so it's okay to kill people under certain circumstances. Interesting, Jesus didn't differentiate. But anyway, we look at Gideon. Gideon is a man who struggles with faith and superstition, and so that's why he asks God for a sign. Today, like I said, David, he has got some horrific behavior that I think we often read and just sort of gloss over, and I want to make sure that I'm faithful to what I believe the Lord has called me to talk about, and that we highlight some of these things and really pull on that string. So we understand God doesn't, call the equipped, he equips the called. That's a very tired and worn out phrase. But God often chooses people that the world overlooks. That is the thing that we gather about David's story. Now, when God does that, he demonstrates that his purpose is not determined by a person's status or their strength. It's not determined by anything other than their heart and their attitude toward obedience. Now, David's rise from a shepherd to a king teaches us that God sees potential where others see insignificance. And so looking backward, David is one of those great, righteous, mighty men of God. But if you work your way through the text, he is not in that place as the story of his life begins. And so, background, right? David is a humble shepherd boy. We are introduced to David as the youngest of 8 brothers. He is tending sheep when the prophet Samuel arrives to anoint the next king of Israel. So God sends Samuel and he says, go, you are going to anoint the next king of Israel. Now, David's own father did not consider that David was even worthy of such a calling. Now, keep in mind, there are lots of sons, lots of families all across Israel at this point in time. David was one kid in a family, and he was the 8th kid in a family that God sent Samuel specifically to. So calls all the kids, and his dad says, Jesse says, okay, well, here's this kid. Samuel's like, nope, that's not him. Well, here's this one. Nope, that's not him. And so finally, he says that famous phrase, there is another. And so there is another. And this young little boy, maybe 7, 8, 9 years old, he is anointed king of Israel. Sometimes I think we just read over that and we don't really recognize sort of the significance, the age that these things were thrust upon him. You can say maybe he was 12, you can say he was 15. There's any number of, ages. Ages are sometimes calculated rather roughly in the Bible. It's a topic for another discussion. So 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance, nor on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. It's interesting. When Jesus came, he was asked, are you going to now, set forward the kingdom? Is this the time that you're going to overthrow Rome? And, Jesus had some very frank answers to that question. You're looking at things the wrong way. And that goes back all the way through humankind. Humankind thinks that they see things one way, and God sees them clearly differently. Proverbs 14:12. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. So all of these sons come by, and Samuel says to Jesse, he says, are all your sons here? And he said, sometimes, I worked many years in the legal field. Lawyers don't ask questions that they don't know the answer to already. And so Samuel is asking the question, just like God asked the question to Adam. He said, oh, Adam, where are you? I can't seem to find you, Adam. Where could you be? And so here Samuel says, are all your sons here? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. Probably not the best job in the world. Samuel said to Jesse, send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. Now, did he mean literally they're not going to sit down until he comes? Were they going to just stand? How far away was David? We're not really told. Not as clearly as we'd like. You send someone your map location and you give them an ETA. I'll be there in 12 minutes. So Samuel says, we will not sit down. We will not sit down to eat. We don't know. We will not sit down to rest. We don't know. Samuel is an old man at this point in time. We will not sit down until he comes. So even though David's family overlooked him, the man of God did not. God saw a future king, a man after his own heart. And that's one of the things that we love to preach about David, is that he was a man after God's own heart. Well, was he a man that acted like God, or was he the kind of man that God sought to use to introduce and reinforce this idea of redemption? So David his call is that he is anointed for a greater purpose. Right? And so Samuel anointed David as king while he was a shepherd boy. Though he wasn't yet crowned, David embraced his calling with faithfulness and humility. We don't know that. We assume that he embraced that with humility, but I think that fits into the narrative that we're used to talking about. And so it says that Samuel takes the horn of oil, 1 Samuel 16:13, and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And that's the part that I think is really important. So the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. But even though David was covered in the Spirit of God, he still struggled. He had some serious moral failures, ethical failures. So now he faces outward struggle, conquering the giants, right, in these enduring trials. David's faith indeed was tested when he faced Goliath. Goliath is described as a giant warrior, and he terrified the Israelite army. David, being young and inexperienced, trusted God's power, right, rather than his own ability. That's what we see. Now, was David so confident? That's what we read. That's how we read the text, that David says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that comes and threatens and challenges the army of God?" And it says that he picked up these stones, and there's all kinds of messages that you can read or listen to about the quality and the nature of these stones. There are people that have said they know exactly what kind of stones they were. I don't know what kind of stones they were. It was the right kind of stone, I can tell you that. And so David swings this sling that he has, and if you've ever used a slingshot, like, they're kind of easy to use. You sort of generally aim it and point it. But the whole idea of having this leather thong, right, that is kind of twisted on the ends, it's fashioned, and there's this little pocket, right? And so you got to swing this over your head like this, and then you got to let it go at the right time. Now, I don't know if some of these shots zinged past Goliath's head, but one of them didn't. And with that one stone, David slew Goliath. So it says in 1 Samuel 17:50, "So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. And there was no sword in the hand of David." So David's triumph over Goliath, right? What we see, how we read it in the Bible, the way that we have come to understand the way it's taught, it is not just a victory on the battlefield, it is a testament of God's power working through David's faith. That David said, "I am not going to tolerate this uncircumcised Philistine coming and denigrating the army of the Lord." But then David has a fall. And so 2 Samuel, this is now 1 Samuel into 2 Samuel 11, 1 through 5. This is a story of a complete moral and ethical failure. David, the king of Israel, the man after God's own heart, the man who, once he was anointed with oil, the Spirit of the Lord God rushed upon David. From that day forward, he is guilty of abduction, rape, and murder. Now, those are strong statements, and I totally get it. I'm going to ask that you just bear with me as I read this passage and then break it down in a way that should make sense to all of us. So David, the man after God's own heart, guilty of abduction, rape, and murder. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon, when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. Tempted, right? Lust. If you've looked upon a woman with lust, you have already committed adultery. I don't know how many wives David had, but he sees this one. And David sent and inquired about the woman. "Who is that lady?" And one said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her. Now, she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." Now let's talk about this for a minute. It says that David gets up from his couch and decides to go walking on the roof. So he's looking around, and he happens to see a woman bathing on the roof. Now, I have heard preachers say that Bathsheba was there to tempt him. I have heard people say that Bathsheba was there to get noticed, and he doesn't know who she is. And so he sent and inquired. He says, "Who is this beautiful lady? Who is that girl? What's up, girl? I want to know your name." So he sends messengers, and they took her. Now, you can read that however you want. I have heard people say that she was so excited that David called her. She was just in awe and enamored that David, the king of Israel, would look upon her and love her. He kidnapped her. That was an abduction. He abducted this woman, then he raped her. Now, it doesn't say that she came to him because she wanted to. Sometimes you're put in a position, and I believe Bathsheba was put in a position where she really didn't have a whole lot of choice. Here is that imbalance of power, the power dynamic that the king of Israel, if he says he wants you, what are you going to do? Who are you to say? I have heard people say that women who dress a certain way deserve what they get. I disagree. We should never, ever be sexually abusive to anyone, ever. But that's what David did. So he kidnaps this woman, then he rapes her, and then he sends her on a walk of shame back home. He's like, get out of here. I'm done with you. Go back where you were. Go take another bath. Get out of here. And she then sends to David, and she says, I'm pregnant. Now, it doesn't say, and of course we understand that David has an encounter with a prophet who talks to him about this one little sheep that someone had. But David isn't in a position where he's taking responsibility. He's kind of, by the description and definition of it, a deadbeat dad. He doesn't want responsibility for this child. The text does not say that he wants responsibility for this child. Rather, he does everything he can to get rid of Uriah the Hittite. And Uriah sleeps outside. He's like, I cannot go in and sleep with my wife when the armies of the Lord are out fighting. And David's like, oh, come on, man. So he finally sends him to the front and has him murdered. Now, was that Uriah's normal place? Do soldiers go to war expecting to die? I'm sure that is something that crosses people's minds. I've never served in the military. Lots of folks that I know have. They have all said, we take up arms and we're prepared to lay down our lives in defense of our country. For God and country, we live and die and bleed for the flag. I'm sure that happened in those days, but it certainly doesn't seem like that was Uriah's normal position on the battlefield, to be in a place where he's up in front. He seems certainly like more of an officer, that he was, in a position of command, and he had people that this authority structure, if you want to be in authority, you must be under authority. So he had to answer to someone, and he had people answering to him, because he tells this one go, and he goes, and he tells this one come, and he comes. He tells this one go do that, and he does that. But David says, send him up to the front where the fighting is the fiercest. Abduction, rape, and murder. You can read that however you want. You can gloss it over. You can pretend that isn't what happened. But the text itself bears out that this man had a complete ethical, moral, and biblical failure. He did not do anything that lines up with the heart of God when it came to Bathsheba. In fact, he did everything he ought not do when it came to Bathsheba. He coveted. He killed. He committed adultery. Like, you can just go down this list. He didn't regard her the way that we're supposed to see others made in the image or the similitude of God. Rape, abduction, rape, and murder. David, guilty. But we see him as this mighty man of God. And I'm not saying that he shouldn't be. David was called to lead despite those failures. He was called to lead despite the fact that he had not only humble beginnings, but he had absolutely atrocious behavior. What's the lesson? Leadership is always rooted in faithfulness and in courage. Now, David, this journey from shepherd to king to abductor, rapist, and murderer to mighty man of God, that is his journey. And what it shows us is that God values a heart that trusts him despite outward qualifications. God honors and loves a heart and values a heart that is broken and contrite. That's what David wrote. Broken and contrite spirit. This epic moral failure broke David. Now, he was a man after God's own heart because redemption is what entered into his life. Forgiveness, mercy, and grace. That's what entered into his life. So David isn't a mighty man because he has his 10,000s when Saul has his thousands. David isn't a mighty man of God because he slew Goliath. David isn't a mighty man of God because he was just a child when he was anointed king of Israel. David is a mighty man of God because he faced his moral failings, did something about it, and moved on with his life with that broken and contrite spirit. Now, David is the one that writes Psalm 23, verse 1, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." That's what true leadership is marked by. Not wanting something that you don't have or desiring something that doesn't belong to you. It is recognizing that God will supply your every need. God supplies your need in Christ Jesus. Acts 13:22. "And when he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, whom he testified and said, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will." Now, I don't believe. Put it in the comments if you think it's true. I don't believe that abducting, raping, and murdering was part of God's will, right? That he's like, David, I want you to go do these things. David stepped out of line, but God still used him. And God can use you too. Maybe you've got some struggles much like David did. Maybe your struggles aren't as maybe graphic as David's were. Maybe the things that plague you or the things that you have a hard time with, maybe they are not as devastating as what we see happening in David's life, but they're probably devastating to you. And I think God would have you know that he can work through those circumstances. He can bring about change where nothing seems possible, where it seems as unlikely as could possibly be. God is capable of moving in your life, and I pray that you would find a way to get into his good graces and stay there, knowing that redemption is the call that he has for you. Thank you so much. Next up, we're going to look at Esther.